Hello everybody! It is 9:38, so I am starting this video right at the end of my day, and that's where we're gonna start. Welcome to Chemistry of Cooking, where I tell you the science behind your favorite foods. Tonight, we are going to be making baguettes. In this episode, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the science behind bread making with yeast and also the science of bread making in general and working with microbes and gluten and all that fun stuff. I am using Paul Hollywood's recipe from the Great British Baking Show because I'm a huge fan of the Great British Baking Show and I felt like this recipe was really good. I made these yesterday and tried to film while I was doing it, but they turned out horribly, and I woke up this morning and they were hard as a rock. Like, you could literally take somebody out with them. So we're gonna try it another way. I think my mistakes were that, one, I didn't knead the dough enough, and two, I may have added a little too much water. But we're gonna fix those in take number 2. All right, so before we actually start with the bowl, we're gonna do a little bit of prep work. And so I have actually already put some olive oil in a square plastic container. Paul Hollywood was pretty emphatic about using a plastic container, but I really couldn't find a lot of evidence behind why to use that. But here we go, and it's square, so we've got that, and it's oiled up just to keep the dough from sticking. And we're going to go ahead and set our rising environment for the bread. I'm going to take my water kettle, and we're just going to fill it up. While that's happening, I've already put a small 9-inch brownie pan in my oven to put the hot water in so that the steam can rise. This is the fun part. So I've got a few ingredients here to make the bread. I have some white all-purpose flour. The recipe does call for red flour, but I could not find that in my store. The protein content is pretty similar to bread flour, so hopefully it'll work. I've got about 10 grams of fast-acting yeast, and then I have some salt, and that's about 10 grams of salt. Yeast, as most people know, is a type of microorganism. It's specifically a bacteria that is part of the fungi kingdom. That's right, your bread has bacteria in it. This is essential to making light and fluffy bread. The yeast feeds onto the sugars and starches in the flour and digests it and produces carbon dioxide, which is what produces those air bubbles. Some breads can have a little bit of sugar as their main ingredient, which helps sort of speed the process along for making yeast digest more sugars. However, those air bubbles can die quickly if you don't have a structure to back them up, which is where the flour comes in. Gluten in flour is what helps build that structure. Gluten is 2 types of proteins put together, glutenin and gliadin. Gliadin? Let's go with gliadin. These 2 proteins form through hydrogen bonds and they help form that structure. And then the 2 proteins combined bind with other protein combinations. Then these structures help trap in the air bubbles that help keep the bread stable, but also light and fluffy. So bread flour is one of the main ingredients in this recipe, even though I am not using an actual bread flour. But bread flour just contains more of those proteins, so it helps build a higher structure and helps your bread rise higher. The more gluten, the more of a rise you're going to get. You can also use all-purpose flour like I am using as a substitute for bread flour, by the way. It's just gonna be a little bit less chewy. Salt is a very important flavoring agent, but one important thing to remember is to never ever put the salt directly onto the yeast or the yeast directly onto the salt. The salt will suck out all of the moisture in the yeast and kill it. So do what I did and put them on opposite sides of the bowl and let them come together naturally with the help of water. Right, so now we're gonna slowly add the remaining water. Last time, I think I maybe added a little too much water, so I'm gonna add it really slowly and just kind of eyeball it and see how long it takes for the dough to become hydrated. Water not only helps bring your dough together, but it also hydrates the yeast. Normally, when you buy yeast from the store, it is dry, and in order to reactivate it, you have to hydrate it. With active dry yeast, you typically have to dissolve it in a warm water of about 110 to 115 degrees in order for it to keep living. With fast action yeast, the microbes are smaller, so they tend to reactivate very easily. Therefore, you don't need to dissolve them in warm water, you just need to put them in the bread and let them have that rising environment. All right, so that right now is starting to sort of come together, but our water is still heating up, so I'm going to take it and pour it into the brownie pan in the oven. And then we're gonna shut it really fast so that the steam starts to create a more humid environment. The kneading process is extremely important for building up that gluten network. The more we roll and fold the dough, the more gluten structures that are going to be built up because those proteins can come together a lot easily. And therefore, the better structure that's going to be built. You'll know when your bread is kneaded enough and when there's enough of a gluten structure, when the dough is pulling onto itself. So in other words, it's not sticking onto your fingers, it's pulling into itself. If you're using a mixer to knead, it should pull away from the sides of the bowl and form a ball in the center. Okay, so I'm gonna show you guys a little bit with the dough. So the dough is not ready yet because it's still like kind of sticking to my hand a little bit. So it's not ready yet, but I do want to show you a little bit about what those proteins are actually doing. So the bread is kind of elasticy, like it's, I don't know if you can see it, but it's like pulling back on itself. And so that's what we want. That means the gluten proteins are starting to kind of bind together. All right, so my dough is pretty much kneaded. So as you can see, it's, unlike before, it was sticking to my hands like for a while, but as you can see, it's not sticking to my hands anymore and I can handle it. It's also very smooth. Now that we have our dough, I'm gonna take it, plonk it in the bowl, the plastic container, and we're gonna let it go to sleep. So I've got a clean kitchen towel and I'm just gonna put it over it so that it has a nice warmish place. And now it's time for it to rise. This is basically the time for yeast to activate and start thriving. It's going to start feeding on those sugars and starches in the flour, and it's going to start building those air bubbles. Luckily now it has the gluten structure to support those air bubbles. All right, so Paul Hollywood said that it is super, super important that your bread rise in a plastic square container. Now, the square container is supposed to be essential for forming the structure of the bread. However, I really couldn't find any sort of scientific evidence about this, so I'm just gonna assume it's so that you have to handle it less. I don't know. But we also wanna rise it in a plastic container. A lot of bread recipes will say that you need to use a metal or a ceramic bowl, but you can definitely use plastic. In fact, a lot of bakeries use plastic because it's easier to stack the dough. So we also want to put oil in the bowl because it'll keep the bread moist. Obviously, if you just let a dough sit out, the water's going to evaporate and it's going to form a dry crust on top. So we put some oil in the bowl in order to keep it a little bit moist, and we cover it with a rag. And then we also want to keep oil in the bowl so that the dough doesn't stick to the bowl. Yeast needs an environment of about 70 to 80 degrees in order to fully rise. It's a living thing, it needs a certain temperature to survive. So what we want to do is create that environment. Ideally, you want to put your bread in a place that is between 70 and 80 degrees. So if your house is cold, you might want to use your oven. And then you also want to place it in a slightly humid environment to keep the dough moist. So I am using my oven because I don't have a fancy proving drawer, and it's also draft free. Yeast does not like any kind of draft. So in order to completely prevent that, I put it in the oven. As you can see, it is very airy right now and it has almost doubled in size. And it's a little bit sticky too. Oh my goodness. So I got a little bit of a floured surface, and I'm gonna flour my hands a little bit. And we are just going to shape the dough into 4 pieces. And so I'm just gonna take it. We don't want to handle it too much because we do want it to still keep the air bubbles. So we're gonna take a cutting knife. You can use one of those fancy dough knives, but I just use the sharp cutting knife. And we're just going to slice it into 4 pieces. What I'm basically doing is I'm kind of flattening it just a little bit lengthwise and then folding it into the center. So it kind of forms like an envelope. Now I'm going to be taking the towel that I used earlier, make sure it is a clean towel because it's going to be touching the bread, and I'm basically going to put it in my flour and just let it coat itself. Okay, so I'm basically going to put a baguette onto a couche or towel, I guess, and make a little fold in it so that it is nice and partitioned. And according to Hollywood, this is just to keep the dough from rising outwards. We want it to rise up. And now we're going to take another towel. This is not a kitchen towel, it's a bath towel, but I just washed it, so it's clean. And we're just going to place it right over so that it doesn't dry out. It's kind of like you're just tucking them into bed. And now we are going to let them rise for 1 more hour or until doubled in size. All right, real quick, there's about 8 minutes left on the timer. So I preheated my oven to 470 degrees, which is pretty hot, but that's what it says. It originally says Celsius, but we're in the US where we have to follow Fahrenheit for some reason. The metric scale is not allowed here. I also left the brownie pan in there so that I can pour water onto it to create steam when I put the bread in. Okay, so my timer just went off, so now I'm going to take these baguettes, unroll them, and they are all doubled in size, and they spring back slightly when you poke them. And so I have some prepared floured oven tins right here, and I'm just going to gently move them over. So next we're going to cut the baguettes into 4 long strands and let them rise again, like Jesus did. And then they will be ready to go into the oven. But first, we need to score the bread. So the bread does its final rise in the oven, and we actually call that an oven spring. And in order to let the bread do that, we have to score it, which means cutting through that skin that has developed on top of the bread. So we want to cut through it and let the bread have some room to rise. You can do it with a really sharp knife, or you can use one of those fancy scoring tools, or you can just use a clean razor blade. I had to work quickly, so I didn't show what I did with the steam, but basically I just put the baguettes in there and then I just poured the water into the pan and it creates some steam, and then I close the oven door really quick so that as much steam as possible stays in the oven. And now it's time to bake, and in order to do this, we need steam. Professional bakeries that bake a lot of bread will actually have steam ovens where they can control the amount of steam. We don't have that, so I'm going to be using a pan full of water at the bottom of my oven. So I'm using the brownie pan and I'm pouring about 1.5 cups of water. You don't want to overdo it with the steam. Just about 1.5 cups is fine. And you want to let that sit in your oven while it's preheating, and then you will slide the baguettes in really quickly in order to allow steam. The steam will keep the bread soft so that it can rise some more in developing that oven spring. And later on, it will help that crust form. I just took them out of the oven and they look amazing. They have those little like flour streaks on them that I really like. And they're not the prettiest baguettes in the world, but they are fresh. You guys, this tastes amazing. And it did not flop. They are not rock hard. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to give it a big thumbs up. And if you have any requests, then feel free to comment them. Also, if you want to see more, subscribe to my channel. And if you want to support me so that I can make more videos, you can support me on Patreon. Alright, I will see you guys in my next video. Goodbye! If you guys have ever read like Harry Potter in French, one of the funny things about the translation is that wand translates to baguette. So like it just says like baguette-making, like, and all of the language is like Harry waved his baguette. And I'm just imagining like Harry and all of his people waving like these pieces of bread around like Wingardium Leviosa. Yeah.